I was still wiping icing sugar from my hands when she changed the locks. That house, my bakery, everything I'd built from scratch, gone, just like that. Taken with a legal signature and a smug smile. My mother-in-law had finally done what she'd threatened for years. And I let her. My name is Claire Bennett. I'm 32 years old. And last year, I lost the business I'd spent 7 years growing, because I trusted the wrong family. I wasn't naive. I wasn't foolish. I knew the undercurrents were there, knew the way she looked at me during family dinners, as if I'd borrowed something she intended to take back. But love makes you do strange things. It dulls the edges of warnings. Makes you think bloodlines come with boundaries. It was supposed to be simple. My bakery, Sunday and Flour, had become a local favorite. We started with artisan bread, slowly expanded into wedding cakes, then added a brunch menu that brought in crowds every weekend. I ran every shift. Managed the staff. Built relationships with suppliers. I even designed the custom shelving myself. But the paperwork? The business license, the real estate contracts, the incorporation details, those I had signed with Daniel, my husband, and his mother, as a formality, they said. A way to qualify for the better loan terms his mother could secure with her impeccable credit and lengthy portfolio. At the time, I thought it was a gift. A support. It was a trap. She waited until the expansion was finished. Until we'd doubled our revenue. Until my staff was loyal, our social media was thriving, and we'd landed a local magazine feature. Then she pounced. Daniel was the one who told me, half whispering across our kitchen counter one evening, eyes darting like a cornered child. He said, "Mom's changing the board structure. You'll still have a role, just not decision-making." I replied, "You mean she's cutting me out?" He didn't deny it. He just looked down at his coffee, as if the mug held better answers than I did. That was a Tuesday. By Friday, the locks were changed. My name removed from the business account. The website updated with her photo, her bio, her words, founded by the Bennett family. I stood outside the glass storefront, my keys useless in my hand. One of the bakers, a 19-year-old girl I'd trained myself, wouldn't even meet my eyes. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I went home, made tea, and sat at the kitchen table until the sun went down. Because I knew, even then, that this wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning. And she had no idea who she'd just picked a fight with. She didn't steal my business overnight. She softened the soil first, year by year, until the roots were weak enough to pull loose with one sharp tug. Long before the locks changed, long before I stood outside my own bakery like a stranger, there were signals. Not loud. Never that. She was a master of subtlety. It started with compliments. "You're a natural, Claire," she said the first time she visited the bakery, back when we were still leasing a small corner unit near the co-op. "I can see why my son fell for you. You've got a good head on your shoulders." But then, minutes later, she'd casually ask if I'd considered selling cupcakes instead of sourdough. "You'd attract a younger crowd. More Instagrammable," she said. I nodded politely, pretending I didn't feel the sting. I always nodded. That was my mistake. Back then, I believed good work would speak for itself. That integrity, quiet, consistent effort, was enough. I had built my world on that assumption. It's how I was raised. My father was a carpenter. My mother, a nurse who worked night shifts for most of my childhood. They never chased credit. They did their jobs with competence and left the boasting to others. We were a quiet family. Kind, but understated. We gave without needing thanks. We worked hard, and we paid our debts. My parents never owned a business, but they built their life from nothing. My mother lost her father at 13. My father dropped out of high school to take care of his younger siblings after their mother left. When they married, they had $200 between them and slept on a mattress on the floor of a one-bedroom rental. But they raised me with dignity. Not entitlement. And they taught me that independence was sacred. I think that's what made Daniel so appealing in the beginning. He wasn't flashy. He had this quiet confidence about him, solid, like someone who understood how to share silence without making it awkward. We met at a wine tasting I didn't even want to attend. He was pouring for a local distributor, and I was there as a last-minute favor for a friend. We started talking about yeast. Not romance, not careers, not childhood dreams. Just fermentation and the balance of sour versus subtle in artisan baking. He said, "You know, bread like that takes patience. Most people don't have it." I replied, "Most people want results before the oven's even preheated." He smiled like he understood something about me that I hadn't even said. It wasn't fast, but it was easy. The way love sometimes is when you're not chasing it. We dated for over a year before he proposed. I said yes because he made the world feel less sharp. Less lonely. His mother, Evelyn, gave us her blessing in the form of a single sentence that would haunt me for years: "If you can keep up with our family, you'll do just fine." She said it during our engagement dinner. We were seated at a long table at her favorite French restaurant, the kind where the servers wore gloves and no one raised their voice above a whisper. I was pouring water into Daniel's glass, smiling politely, and she said it like a toast, but there was no warmth behind it. I remember the way my hand trembled slightly, the water spilling just enough to leave a ring on the tablecloth. I should have listened more closely. But love makes you look past warnings when they come wrapped in politeness. Evelyn Bennett was never cruel outright. She was strategic. Her power came from knowing which truths to say out loud and which to let rot quietly behind closed doors. She never criticized me directly. She praised me in ways that left bruises. "This bread is incredible," she said once, biting into a rosemary boule I had spent hours perfecting. "So much better than your usual batch. Did someone else help today?" Later, she started dropping by more often. Offering to help with the books. Suggesting changes to the decor. Small things at first. A new espresso machine. A revised staff schedule. A more upscale logo. She had an eye for aesthetics, I'll admit that. And when we were planning our expansion, she offered to co-sign the commercial lease so we could secure a larger space in the old cannery district. I was hesitant, but Daniel said it would be a blessing. His mother had excellent credit. She knew how to navigate banks and city permits. I didn't. I was tired. We were growing fast. I needed help. So I agreed. We added her as a minority partner. "Just on paper," Daniel said. "She won't interfere with day-to-day operations. It's just to streamline things." Except she did interfere. Gradually. She began introducing herself as co-founder. Rewriting the brand story in interviews. Booking photo shoots without telling me. Hiring consultants I'd never met. And I let it happen. Because I believed that if I just worked harder, stayed focused, and avoided conflict, the integrity of the work would protect me. But she didn't care about the work. She cared about the narrative. The brand. The control. Even so, I would have never imagined she'd go this far. Until last week. Daniel came home late. He'd started doing that more often. There was flour in my hair and aching in my feet, and I was sitting at the kitchen island with a mug of tea when he dropped the folder in front of me. Revised operating agreement. My name, demoted. Evelyn's, upgraded. Majority stakeholder. I looked at him and asked, "Why?" He didn't answer at first. Just stared at the sink. So I said again, softer this time, "Why would you do this?" He finally said, "She thinks the brand needs new leadership. You're too close to it." Too close. Like proximity was the problem. Like knowing every brick in that bakery, every name on the payroll, every regular customer's favorite loaf, somehow made me less qualified to lead. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't ask him to pick sides. Because I already knew whose side he was on. It wasn't mine. That night, I lay awake tracing back every moment I'd handed over a key. Every time I signed something I didn't fully read. Every time I said yes just to keep the peace. The next morning, I opened the drawer in our hallway cabinet and pulled out a file I hadn't touched in years. Original invoices. Ingredient sourcing ledgers. My first supplier contracts. Notes from the first business plan I wrote at 24 years old, scribbled in pencil on the back of grocery receipts. Proof that I didn't just show up one day with an apron and a dream. I built that place with my own hands. And now, I was going to take it back. Not with shouting. Not with threats. But with something they never expected me to have. A plan. They weren't just trying to erase me. They were hoping I'd quietly disappear, so the narrative could continue without interruption. In the weeks that followed, silence wrapped itself around my life like a second skin. I didn't answer calls. I stopped going downtown. I deleted the social apps I'd once used to promote every tart, every rising loaf, every morning sunbeam hitting the front counter just so. Let them have the attention. I needed distance. At first, Daniel still texted. Little things. Are you okay? I didn't think it would get this far. Please let's talk. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say to someone who had watched me unravel, inch by inch, and said nothing until the last thread snapped. He moved out of the apartment 3 days after the locks were changed at the bakery. Said it would give us space. As if space had ever been the problem. What I felt wasn't rage. It was something colder. Weightier. A quiet vacancy that filled my lungs when I tried to sleep. An ache behind my eyes that never quite dissolved, no matter how long I stared at the ceiling. I couldn't cry. Grief needs permission to speak, and I hadn't granted it yet. Instead, I sorted. Receipts, contracts, employment records. The early years, when it was just me and a part-time barista I'd hired from the community college. Before Evelyn. Before branding agencies and PR firms and investment consultants who spoke in acronyms. I found the original business plan, the one I drafted at that old cafe on Elm Street where I'd once tempeed as a dishwasher just to learn how real kitchens ran. The binder was dog-eared and stained with butter, my handwriting cramped in the margins filled with hope. Reading it now, it felt like a conversation with a younger version of myself. One who still believed that merit was armor. I photocopied everything, added annotations, and organized it chronologically. There was something therapeutic in the order. In proving to myself, page by page, that I had built something real. But the pressure outside my quiet apartment was growing. I started hearing from former employees. One barista emailed, "Claire, it's weird here. Evelyn's changing everything. She says we're rebranding but no one knows what that means. The sourdough's gone. And she let Diego go. Just thought you should know." The emails were short. Tentative. Like people didn't know whose side they were allowed to be on. I didn't blame them. Some of them had families. Rent. Student loans. And Evelyn knew how to make things look polished, professional. She didn't scream or threaten. She reorganized. Restructured. Optimized, she called it. I heard through a supplier that she'd started a new line of branded merchandise. Aprons, mugs, tote bags. My logo, my handwriting, traced from the original sign I painted myself, was replaced with a sleek, serif font. Generic. Polished. Soulless. One afternoon, I drove past the bakery without meaning to. I hadn't been back since that morning when my key didn't work. The new sign hung above the door, white and brass, clinical and cold. Inside, a group of influencers sat at the window table, ring lights illuminating their lattes. The counter had been replaced with marble. The chalkboard with an LED menu. And there, behind the counter, stood Evelyn. In a designer blazer. Speaking with a local news reporter I recognized. Smiling like she'd just stepped out of a lifestyle magazine. She looked comfortable. triumphant. Like I'd never existed. I parked around the corner and sat in the car with the engine off, fingers gripping the steering wheel until they turned white. I didn't go inside. I didn't need to. Instead, I called someone I hadn't spoken to in months. Her name was Janice. We'd met years ago during a food safety training session, back when she worked for the state's health department. She'd left government work to become a private consultant, helping small businesses prepare for inspections and permitting reviews. Janice didn't sugarcoat anything. She was precise, professional, and allergic to shortcuts. She answered on the second ring. I said, I need to know everything they've changed. Legally. She didn't ask questions. Just said, I'll look into it. Over the next week, she sent me documents. Business filings. Zoning updates. Permit applications. On paper, they'd made it look seamless. Claire Bennett, removed as managing partner. Evelyn Bennett, installed as president. Daniel, silent co-owner with no active authority. But something was off. Janice highlighted a discrepancy in the timeline. A filing had been submitted under my name, 2 weeks after I was removed from the business bank account. A forged signature. I stared at the PDF, zoomed in until the letters blurred. It was close. Almost perfect. But I never looped my R in Claire. Never have. Not once. She said, you could press charges. I replied, not yet. Because I knew Evelyn. She was too smart to leave fingerprints unless she was confident no one would look. But if she'd forged that one document, maybe there were others. Meanwhile, Daniel's texts had stopped. The bakery's Instagram now featured Evelyn's face in profile shots, her hands carefully staged around croissants I knew she didn't know how to make. In the comments, people asked, where's Claire, and did ownership change? The bakery's responses were vague. Sunday and flour is evolving. Stay tuned. One post featured a soft launch of a new menu, avocado toast, truffle fries, lavender lattes. My bread wasn't on the menu anymore. Not even the signature rye that had built our morning crowd from scratch. And then, on a Wednesday morning, I received a text from Diego, the baker they'd fired without notice. You didn't hear this from me. But they're applying for a trademark on your rosemary focaccia. New name. New claim. Says it's a family recipe now. I stared at the message. It wasn't about money anymore. Or even ownership. It was about identity. They weren't just running the bakery. They were rewriting the origin story. Turning my work into their brand. My hands into their legacy. And Evelyn, she was claiming matriarchal wisdom. Family heritage. A tradition passed down, according to the press release Janice forwarded me 2 days later. Except it wasn't. She didn't bake. She didn't rise at 3 a.m. to prep dough. She didn't spend years experimenting with hydration levels or proofing temperatures. She didn't stand behind the register when our point-of-sale system crashed, ringing in orders by memory while smiling at impatient customers. But she knew how to speak in interviews. She said, we've always been passionate about artisanal baking. It's in our blood. I didn't recognize the woman on the screen. And maybe I never really had. That night, I pulled out a notebook and started listing everything she'd claimed. Every product, every phrase, every fabricated tradition. Then I opened the oldest hard drive I had. The one I hadn't touched since before the bakery opened. Inside were time-stamped photos, recipe development notes, videos of the early test batches, emails with suppliers. Proof. Not just of ownership. But of authorship. And that's when I stopped feeling numb. I still didn't cry. But the ache behind my eyes finally turned into focus. Because I'd been wrong before. This wasn't about taking back what she stole. It was about showing her what I'd never given away. They could take my storefront. They could rebrand my recipes. But they would never own the proof of how it all began. I printed everything: grainy photos of my first sourdough trials, voice memos detailing hydration tweaks, spreadsheets I'd built from scratch to monitor cost-to-margin ratios down to the cent. I organized it into a single, chronological folder, backing it up 3 different ways. I wasn't just building a case. I was protecting a legacy. I hadn't told anyone what I was doing yet. Not even Janice. I needed to move quietly. The louder the move, the easier it was to intercept. And I knew how Evelyn operated. If she even sensed I was preparing to fight, she'd take preemptive steps. File more paperwork. Maybe even smear my name publicly. But what she didn't understand, what none of them seemed to understand, was that I had time. I wasn't interested in dramatic reversals or social media vindication. I wanted precision. Impact. Something that wouldn't just expose the lie, but make it undeniable. I started by reaching out to a lawyer I'd worked with briefly during the early days of the bakery. Her name was Sasha Nguyen. She'd reviewed one of my vendor contracts 3 years ago and corrected a clause that would have given us supplier ownership over recipe variants. Back then, I thought she was overly cautious. Now, I realized she was the only reason my rosemary focaccia wasn't already Evelyn's intellectual property. Sasha remembered me. She said, "You kept good records." "That helps." I replied, "I kept everything." We met in her office downtown, a modest space with floor-to-ceiling windows and shelves stacked with case files. She wore no makeup, spoke with clipped precision, and never once looked surprised by anything I told her. I slid the folder across the desk. She asked, "Do you want to sue for damages?" I said, "I want them to stop pretending they created something they didn't." She nodded slowly, then asked for copies of all business filings, original brand materials, and every communication involving the transfer of ownership. It was strange, sitting there while she flipped through my story like a textbook. My handwriting in the margins. The notes about shelf life and humidity. The grain specs from the supplier who'd gone out of business 2 years ago. She said, "This isn't just strong. This is airtight." For the first time in weeks, I let myself exhale. Sasha began drafting a cease and desist. Not just for the recipe branding, but for the trademark application Evelyn had submitted under false pretenses. We weren't accusing her outright, not yet. We were simply requesting they withdraw the filings and cease marketing my original creations under their new umbrella. But that was just the beginning. Because while Sasha handled the legal side, I returned to something older. Quieter. Mine. I started baking again. Not for profit. Not for an audience. Just for clarity. I pulled the old cast-iron Dutch oven out of the storage unit. Drove 2 hours to the co-op that still carried the regional flour I used to swear by. At midnight, while the city was asleep, I folded dough on my kitchen counter and listened to the silence. The rhythm came back slowly. Like muscle memory returning after injury. There's something sacred about bread. It forgives your absence if your hands remember how to shape it. Every loaf I baked went to someone who had been with me in the beginning. Diego got a bowl wrapped in parchment, left quietly on his porch. The old couple who ran the wine bar down the street from the bakery, they received a seeded rye with a note, "Thank you for believing in me when I didn't." Each delivery grounded me again. Each one reminded me that while Evelyn might own the building, she didn't own the soul that moved through it. By the second week, word started to spread. Customers from the old bakery began messaging me privately. "Are you baking again? Please tell me there's a way to order. I miss your olive loaf so much." "That new stuff they sell?" "Not the same." I didn't answer. Not yet. Instead, I began documenting. Recording videos, not for TikTok or Instagram, but for timestamps. Process shots. Ingredient breakdowns. I logged every batch. Because if Evelyn tried to copy anything else, I wanted a record proving I'd been there first. Again. Then something unexpected happened. A woman named Lena reached out. She used to work for a small culinary magazine. Said she remembered me from a feature they ran years ago on women who bake to build. She'd left journalism to become a copywriter, but still followed food circles out of habit. She said, "Claire, I saw the rebranding post. The family recipe story. It didn't sit right. I knew that focaccia wasn't Evelyn's. Everyone knows it's yours." I replied, "It doesn't matter what people know. It matters what they can prove." She offered to help. Not with publicity, she understood I didn't want attention yet, but with something better. Research. She pulled archived articles, Yelp reviews, even scraped old Instagram posts with geotags and timestamps, evidence tying my name, my image, my voice, to every product Evelyn now claimed as her own. By the end of the week, I had a timeline going back 5 years. Every new menu item, every event, every collaboration, traced to me. Sasha filed a formal response to the trademark office. Then, without warning, Evelyn made the first move. A letter arrived by courier. From her lawyer. Polite in tone. Stating that any attempt to misrepresent Sunday and Flour's current branding as theft would result in legal retaliation. The letter called me a former partner who had willingly exited the business, and requested that I refrain from leveraging past associations to promote competing services. I handed the envelope to Sasha without reading the second page. She read it once, set it down, and said, "She's nervous." I asked, "Why?" Sasha tapped the signature. "Because people who are confident don't send preemptive threats." We filed a response. Attached documentation. Then made a quiet move of our own, requesting a public hearing with the Trademark Review Board. Evelyn would have to appear, or at least send a representative, to defend her claim. And everything she'd filed would be examined. The hearing was set for 2 months out. I didn't tell anyone. Not Daniel. Not even the people who'd supported me silently for weeks. I kept baking. I kept documenting. And one quiet morning, just after sunrise, I went for a walk past the bakery. It was open early. The window steamed. Inside, Evelyn stood behind the counter, laughing at something on her phone. Daniel wasn't there. The staff had changed again, young, polished, no one I recognized. But then I saw it. A chalkboard leaning near the espresso machine. Decorative calligraphy, probably drawn by some hired graphic designer. It read, "New, House Rosemary Focaccia, a family staple." My hand didn't shake. My breath didn't hitch. I just stood there, watching. They had doubled down. They'd taken the name. The story. The essence. Which meant they believed I was finished. That I had nowhere else to go. But I wasn't going back to the old Claire. The one who thought love would protect her. I was building something else now. Something they couldn't brand or bake their way out of. They didn't see the storm coming because I didn't raise my voice. The day of the hearing arrived in a quiet drizzle, the kind of rain that made everything feel suspended, like the world was holding its breath. I wore a navy blazer and a linen blouse, clean lines, neutral tones. No makeup except for a soft stroke of mascara. I wanted to look like what I was, unshaken. Prepared. Sasha met me outside the administrative building downtown. The hearing wasn't in a courtroom, not formally, but it felt like one. A narrow conference room, 3 panelists at the end of a long table, microphones angled toward us like silent judges. Evelyn arrived 7 minutes late. She entered with the poise of someone used to attention, dressed in a tailored ivory suit that probably cost more than my first month's rent in the city. She didn't look at me. Not once. Instead, she nodded to her lawyer, a polished man with perfect posture and too much cologne. Daniel wasn't with her. I wondered if that meant something. But I didn't have the energy to care. The panel began with formalities. Sasha spoke first, presenting our evidence, organized, time-stamped, annotated. Emails, photos, original recipe files, supplier contracts from the earliest days. Even the video I'd filmed 2 years ago, walking through the Rosemary Focaccia's development, explaining the fermentation process and the balance of oil and herb. It was undeniable. I didn't need to argue. I didn't need to plead. All I had to do was let the truth breathe. Then it was Evelyn's turn. Her lawyer began with a polished summary of the Bennett family's culinary contributions, referring to sundae and flour as a generational evolution of artisan baking, inspired by familial passion. I listened without blinking, fingers folded in my lap. Then, mid-sentence, the panelist on the left interrupted him. She said, "This filing references a family recipe for rosemary focaccia. Can you provide documentation establishing this existed prior to Claire Bennett's recorded development?" A beat of silence. Then the lawyer said, "We believe the tradition was oral. Evelyn Bennett recalls learning it as a child." That was when Evelyn finally looked at me. I met her eyes, and for a moment, I saw it, just the briefest flicker of recognition. Not guilt. Not fear. Contempt. I could almost hear what she was thinking. "You should have stayed quiet." The panel requested clarification. A copy of any dated recipe, family cookbook, photograph, anything to show provenance. Evelyn said there were none. "It was always something we made by feel," she explained. "My grandmother never wrote things down." But her tone wasn't maternal. It was curated. Then Sasha slid the final document across the table. A page torn from one of my first kitchen notebooks. Written in pencil. Dated in the corner. Annotated in my handwriting. The draft of the focaccia recipe, crossed out, adjusted, refined. The panel took it. The lawyer looked at it. Evelyn didn't. The panelist in the center said, gently, "We'll review and notify all parties within 7 business days." That was all. No gavel. No conclusion. Evelyn stood without a word. Her lawyer collected his papers. She walked past me on her way out, the scent of expensive perfume trailing behind her. I didn't move. Sasha exhaled. "She's rattled," she said quietly. I didn't reply. We walked out together into the overcast afternoon. The city hummed like it always did, oblivious to how quietly lives are sometimes reclaimed. I didn't go home. Instead, I walked through the market district, past the co-op where I used to buy flour in 50-pound bags, past the tea shop where I once left gift scones in exchange for silence and kindness. Eventually, I ended up at the foot of a long alley that led to a rental unit. Formerly a studio for a ceramicist who'd moved to Portland. It had a sink. A big window. Concrete floors. The owner still had my number. I texted him. He said, "It's yours if you want it. Month to month, okay?" I replied, "I'll take it." It wasn't a bakery. Not yet. But it was a space. One not tied to anyone else's name, memory, or ambition. That night, I brought my mixer out of storage. The small one I used before the bakery scaled up. I set it on the folding table in the studio and stared at it until the light outside turned orange. The next morning, a delivery arrived. A new batch of flour. Olive oil. Coarse sea salt. The basics. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing. Not even Sasha. I just started. 2 loaves at a time. Then 4. Then 6. Word spread slowly. I didn't advertise. I didn't post. But someone told someone else who missed my rye. Someone remembered the lemon poppy seed scones. A neighbor knocked to ask if the smell was real or imagined. I gave her a warm roll and she left with tears in her eyes. Then Daniel showed up. I was cleaning the counters when I heard the knock. For a second, I thought it was the landlord. But it wasn't. He looked thinner. Tired. His jacket was soaked from rain. He didn't try to smile. I didn't say anything. He said, "I heard about the hearing." I wiped a bowl dry, slowly. He said, "She didn't expect you to follow through." I replied, "She never does." He looked down, then back at me. I'm sorry. The words landed like pebbles in a well, soft, but bottomless. I asked, for what? He swallowed. For letting her do what she did. For not stopping it. For standing there. I leaned against the counter. He said, I kept thinking she was right. That maybe you were too close to the business. That it was just stress, and things would settle. But I watched her strip it all away from you. Piece by piece. And I still didn't stop her. I didn't interrupt. He said, it's over between us. I moved out. Signed my shares back to her. She didn't fight it. I think she knows she's lost. I stayed silent. Then, quietly, he said, I miss you. The words didn't sting. They barely touched me. I replied, you missed your chance. He nodded once, eyes shining. Then left. I didn't watch him go. Instead, I kneaded dough in silence, palms pressing against the counter in a rhythm I knew better than any apology. The hearing decision hadn't arrived yet. But something inside me had already shifted. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about reclaiming oxygen. Identity. Space. And in a few days, the panel would send their verdict. But I already knew what it would say. The email came at 6:04 a.m. as I stood barefoot on the concrete floor, watching dough rise in the early light. I didn't open it right away. I finished shaping the loaves first. There was something ceremonial about that silence, the slow press of my palms into the dough, the dusting of flour over the surface, the weight of each motion deliberate and calm. No performance. No audience. Just proof of work. Then I washed my hands, dried them slowly, and opened the message. The ruling was in my favor. All rights to the rosemary focaccia recipe, including variations and associated branding, were confirmed under my name. The panel found Evelyn's filings misleading and unsupported by verifiable documentation, and recommended that the trademark office deny her application with prejudice. The cease and desist would now become enforceable. She had 2 weeks to remove my products from her menus, retract claims about their origin, and formally notify all distributors, partners, and customers of the misrepresentation. Any further use would result in civil penalties. It was clean. Professional. Quiet. Everything I wanted. I didn't cry. I didn't feel joy, exactly. It was something colder. Like a door clicking shut after months of wind. I forwarded the email to Sasha, then stood still for a long moment before returning to the mixer. That evening, I wrote a letter. Not to Evelyn. Not to Daniel. To the customers who had once filled my bakery's morning hours with quiet chatter, children's laughter, laptop screens glowing under soft lighting. I posted it quietly on a single platform. Thank you for your patience. I'd been baking again. You'll find me a few blocks north of where we started. I'm not calling it Sunday and Flour anymore. Just Claire's Table. Because it started with my hands. And it continues there. No hashtags. No photos. Just the truth. Within 24 hours, I had 48 pre-orders. By the end of the week, I had to ask Janice if she still knew someone who rented commercial ovens by the hour. She did. We made a deal. I worked nights in the shared kitchen and mornings in the studio. I slept in short stretches and wore the same 3 aprons on rotation. But every loaf that left my hands had my name behind it. Nothing borrowed. Nothing stolen. Nothing compromised. I didn't hear from Evelyn. I didn't need to. But I heard about her. From Lena, who still monitored industry newsletters and small food blogs. She sent me a link one morning with the subject line, "Not your problem anymore, but..." It was a short article, local business feature. Sunday and Flour rebrands again amid legal dispute. It was careful, almost neutral. But the wording made it clear something had gone wrong. The article mentioned customer confusion, a dip in sales, and staff turnover. They'd removed the focaccia. The merchandise had been pulled. The bakery now focused on modern brunch options and experience-forward dining. There was no mention of me. No retraction. No apology. Just a pivot. Like I'd never existed. I closed the tab and didn't look back. 2 weeks later, I was prepping a small batch of seeded rye when Diego stopped by. He stood in the doorway with a paper bag in hand, lunch from the deli down the street, probably an excuse to check in without making it formal. He said, "Smells like the old place." I replied, "Better flour. Less overhead." He laughed, then looked around. "You've got something here." I shrugged. "It's small." He said, "It's honest." He didn't stay long. Just enough to remind me I wasn't alone in remembering how it all began. That night, I walked past Sunday and Flour. It looked the same from the outside. Clean glass. Brushed brass. Trendy signage. But there were fewer people inside. The staff moved slower. The light felt dimmer somehow. I didn't linger. Instead, I returned to the studio and opened the folder with my original menu ideas. Items I'd never had time to test. Recipes I'd drafted and abandoned in the chaos of expansion. Now, I had time. And something steadier than ambition. I had control. The next few weeks moved in rhythm with the oven. More customers. More late-night mixing. A neighbor offered me use of their storefront after hours. Another brought me storage racks from their closed-down cafe. A retired barista from my first year offered to help with order pickups. Bit by bit, it grew. But quietly. No investors. No loans. No partners. Just the soft thud of proofed dough on the table, the rustle of parchment, the scent of something that can't be bought or copied, only earned. One morning, I saw Daniel again. He didn't come inside. He stood across the street, a coffee in hand, watching through the window as I arranged sourdough battards on the cooling rack. I didn't wave. Neither did he. But he stayed long enough to understand that I hadn't just moved on. I'd built forward. And I wasn't looking back. He stood there for 10 minutes and never crossed the street. That told me everything I needed to know. Closure doesn't come with a conversation. It comes when the silence stops hurting. The days have softened since then. There's a steadiness to life now, shaped by repetition and restored by control. I still start my mornings before the sun rises. Still measure flour by feel. Still find a kind of holiness in the folds of dough and the smell of yeast blooming. But I'm different. I no longer feel the need to justify where I've been or who I used to be. The new space has taken shape slowly, unpolished, mismatched furniture, concrete floors that never fully dry in winter. There's no branding, no influencers, no press coverage. Just regulars. People who order by name, not trend. A man who always buys an extra loaf for his elderly neighbor. A woman who brings her daughter to watch me knead dough like it's something sacred. Quiet moments, all of them. Sometimes, I catch myself smiling at nothing. That used to scare me, feeling something good without knowing how long it would last. But now, I let it happen. I've learned to trust the slow rise. I've kept the old name tucked away in a notebook. Sunday and Flour. It no longer feels stolen. It feels like something that lived, was lost, and has now been set down gently where it belongs, in the past. People ask if I'll ever try to buy it back. Reclaim the brand. Reopen under the same name. I always say no. Because what I rebuilt isn't a version of what I lost. It's a correction. Sometimes I hear murmurs, Evelyn trying again with a different concept, a new team. Boutique jams, farm-to-table pop-ups. Her name still opens doors. But doors don't keep people. The thing about stories is that the truth doesn't need a spotlight. It endures. It echoes. And eventually, people remember. I received a letter a few weeks ago. No return address. Just my name, handwritten in blue ink. Inside was a check, made out to me, in full. The memo line read, repayment. For everything. I didn't cash it. I folded it once and slid it into the back of the folder where I keep the original rosemary focaccia recipe. Some debts aren't meant to be repaid. They're meant to be carried. Daniel hasn't come by again. I think he understands now that the door isn't just closed, it never existed in the way he thought. Our story was scaffolding, something that helped me build, but was never meant to last. I don't miss him. I miss who I thought he might have been. There's a difference. I've learned that love without alignment becomes erosion. And trust, once cracked, doesn't break, it corrodes, slowly, quietly, until it changes the entire structure. I don't hate them. That would give them space in me I no longer have. Instead, I've turned toward the things I can hold. The weight of fresh loaves. The rhythm of prep days. The sound of my own breath steadying in a room that is entirely mine. I kept the name Claire's Table not because it's clever, but because it's honest. It started as a joke, a placeholder. But over time, it felt right. Because here, every loaf is mine. Every decision is mine. And the table, the one I shape, knead, rest, and rise upon, is finally one I don't have to share with anyone who doesn't belong. Last week, a food writer came by. Said she'd heard about the quiet little studio with the rye people swear tastes like memory. Asked if I'd do a profile. I said no. Not because I'm hiding. But because the work isn't a spectacle. It's a ritual. Some stories don't need telling until they're finished. And this one, I think, has reached its final line. But not its ending. That belongs to something else. Something still proofing. Something I don't need to rush,